Hi, everyone. So, being the community building intern was a really interesting role to step into. Unlike a lot of other intern positions, the things that I was actually making and the things that I was actually exposed to weren't necessarily like physical products or like sets of lines of code. They were things that were a little bit harder to touch, a little bit harder to be exposed to and to share out in a very physical or tangible way sometimes. So one of the things that really inspired me as I was stepping into this position was this idea of like, how do we actually do community building? Like, how does it work, and what are the sort of implicit things inside there, and how do we make that explicit and talk about it and make it something that we can share with other people and learn from other people about? So this presentation today is sort of an exploration of why we build how we build, which is a little bit of why we build how we build, but also a little bit of why we build and how we build. When I was designing this presentation, it came together in a really, really interesting way for me. Those of you who know my background, you know the different things that I've studied. Three of those are philosophy, business, and design. And so I saw this, all of this information that I was exposed to during my internship kind of came together in a really interesting way for me, which was sort of the philosophy of how community building works, the importance of it, the business side of it, some of the more like technical aspects, some of the more perhaps measurable things about it, and then the social design aspect of it, which was kind of like, how do we interact with each other? So I'm going to go through each of these three things. There's two ways to make a presentation. One of them is like a really broad kind of presentation. One of them is a very specific and deep kind of presentation. This one is more of a broad perspective. I thought it was really important because I was exposed to so many different things across the organization and even outside of the organization to give a broad level perspective on it all. So, first, going into the philosophy area. Taking a look at why do people join a community in the first place? Douglas Atkin did some research on this, and it's being exposed to people who you can identify with, where you feel like you don't have to self-edit as much, where you feel like you can become more of yourself. You can bring who you are and find other people who are similar and create together, be a part of something, have a sense of belonging. And at Mozilla, one of those key ideas that people like stepping into and being a part of is this idea that you're not just a consumer, you're actually a creator too. You get to make something together with people. You have the opportunity to participate. That's super cool. Not a lot of organizations have that. It's one of the core aspects of how open source works. And part of the basic ethos of open source is taking what other people do, making it better, and giving it back so we all rise further. It's fundamentally community-oriented. It's about working together. It's about giving back. It's about sharing. It's about collaborating. It's about building. That only works when you have community. That's kind of what makes community building so interesting, is this idea of like, yeah, all these people are coming together. How can we help them get the most out of their experience? What does community building actually do in that regard? So from a broad standpoint, to me it stands out in two parts. It's about having community coordination side and having an internal champion side. And essentially that's being able to bring groups of people together around something, help them connect and do what they want to do, and also touching like at the very center of perhaps whatever the organization is, whoever the hardest person to access is within that organization. It's going from the furthest edge to the deepest center. And community building looks to create structure around that so that you can actually go from the furthest edge to the deepest center and help people from both sides get connected and be fulfilled in wanting to make what needs to be made, being inspired by what needs to be made. So it's about supporting community through this structure. That's a little bit about the philosophy. Again, this idea of being more than a creator, or being more than a consumer. you're actually a creator. Stepping into the business side of it now, what does that kind of look like organizationally? Or how do you approach that? This is one of my favorite examples of how community management works. Essentially, you help people go from it's broken to I want to see it fixed to I can actually do something about it. And the way that's approached is essentially making it easier for issues, more automated type things to be handled. So if you see something that's broken, you can file a bug showing that you want to see it fixed. And then having more of a people approach to that second gap right there, where community members can get mentored by others and actually go to this place of I can do something about it. And here again we have this idea that the furthest edge to the deepest center. It's broken, I can actually do something about it. It really matters to make this explicit because when you do that, when you see it plotted out in this way, you're actually able to see where some gaps are. You're able to fill in, you're able to design around helping this be easier. There's a study done by Harvard Business Review that looked at different kinds of innovation in organizations. And Mozilla falls into, not surprisingly, something called innovation community. All open source works in this way. And this is where participation is open and governance is flat. It's really interesting to know that there are different kinds of innovation, that Mozilla is intentionally a specific kind, that it actually matters to have participation be open, and actually matters to have governance be flat, because it's a place where anyone can propose new ideas and make decisions. And community can be a part of that, and is a part of that. That only works when community is there. A key aspect of that being successful is essentially it must be easy for people to participate. Not that the tasks themselves have to be easy, but that it's easy for them to participate. And that the problem can be partitioned into small chunks that people can work on. That's a part of those 3 dots that we saw going from it's broken to I can do something about it. That needs to be easy to participate, to move along that path. And when the community building team approaches other teams about designing for participation, about bringing more community members into their team, sort of acting as an internal consultant in a way, there's some principles about how we do that, for that to be successful. First is, of course, to build understanding, to know where everyone is at on that team so that we can make the best possible option for them and for the community members. To build connections, because having a broad level view allows you to see where overlaps are. To build clarity, because we can only work together when we have a clear goal. To build trust, which is super important because you're bringing more people into a project and it matters that people trust each other. To build pilots, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. And it's important that it's not a one-size-fits-all because you sort of have to test to see what works in each different situation. And pilots is a great way to do that. And then building win-win. Because again, when you're looking at this idea from the furthest edge to the deepest center, both people need to feel happy about that. Because that creates sustainable community. That allows community to grow. That makes people want to have more community in the projects. Another tool that we look at is called the commitment curve. Essentially, we look at time and commitment. And this is, again, looking at how to make that path to participation easier. It's a fancy line. And essentially, the more time you invest in a project, the more committed you become along that in being a part of that project. It's super simple. It seems like a given. It's really important when that's explicit because when you fill in that line and look at something like submitting a patch, there's actually a lot of steps along that pathway. And if there's a big gap, you can kind of see where you fill that in. So going from landing on the page to submitting a patch, it's kind of a big jump. So maybe there's some things missing in there. Maybe we can make it easier where people can first read some documentation, first file a bug, comment on a first bug. Here we're making small steps so it's easy for people to move along. And as they do that, that also builds trust. Another tool that we look at in partnering with other teams is called the maturity model. This is essentially a way to understand where another team may be at in regards to how much community involvement they have. It's another fancy little line. Looks a little bit different. And when we fill that in, we see different stages where there's pre-work, no community involvement, some learning, then there's starting, bringing a few community in, then the actual learning phase itself, sort of creating pilots, trying to understand what it looks like to bring community in, then the scaling stage, bringing a lot more people in, and the sustaining phase, making sure that the project stays alive with community involvement. It matters making this explicit because then you know how to work with the other teams. You know how to understand where they are, how to best serve what their needs are. Instead of just saying, hey, let's bring community in, you can actually say, oh, you've never worked with community before. Let's start there first. Or, you've been working with community for 20 years. Cool. Let's just add to that a bit more. You can actually combine these two models together. You see that on the commitment curve, increasing time and commitment, the contributors are able to move up. You see in the maturity model, there's a little gap at first. There's no community involvement. And you can sort of fill that gap by designing ways for people to participate. And you actually can design and open up more opportunity than there is space available. And then that kind of narrows back as more people fill in. There's an interesting supply and demand relationship between these two models. So this is the business section of the presentation. I wanted to talk a little bit about community impact and kind of show some examples of where involvement community actually mattered. Just a few quick overview ones. But it's really important to know that it's not just some ambiguous conceptual thing. It actually exists, and all of you guys have worked with community here in this audience. But it's important to talk about that and to talk about how much that mattered. So the first example is Mozilla Location Services. There's an interesting challenge here. Mapping the world. The Firefox OS devices, some of them don't actually have a lot of the same location chips and tracking mechanisms, the cheapest model that like really expensive phones have. So how would we approach designing a system that can still give a lot of the localized content that people expect from smartphones without requiring a lot of the expensive chips that are needed? The Mozilla Location Services team had 7 people on staff. And they created a project where contributors could get involved to help map locations in the world. How many contributors do you think came in? 100. Anybody else? 10. 5,000. So what does that look like? I'm going to show you a map, and all the blue spots are areas that have gotten mapped. That's kind of cool. We had thousands of people all over the world helping make these technology devices better for everyone else. That's why community matters. We couldn't have made that any other way. And that's allowing people all over the world to help make better technologies for each other. Taking what other people do, adding back, making it better, so we can all rise further together. Let's step even higher and take an even broader level perspective. How many people are involved in product development at Mozilla? Employees. Approximately, based on data from Wikipedia and Wolfram. 1,000, good guess. Facebook. A lot more, good guess. Google. How many?
15,000.
That says 52, according to Wolfram. That dot wouldn't even fit on this page if I actually made it to scale, but it's obviously very, very big. That's employee size. And when you look at position, market dominance, Mozilla's still able to be at the same level as all these guys. If not, probably higher than some. How the heck is that possible? There's over 7,000 volunteers and growing. When you look at the size, that makes the number of people involved in making Mozilla products, tools, services, whatever we end up making, that makes a lot more people involved in that. And more so, that's people all over the world who actually care about our mission. And that's kind of what matters, is that this small group of people inspires an even larger group of people to care about the stuff that we support, the open web, having participation, access, and opportunity. Community supports that. That's really big. And that influences how technology is made. Let's get really, really narrow. Look at one particular project, one very particular aspect of a certain project. This is the Get Involved page redesign, looking at input on the designs. We see that 18% of the input came from employees, 72% from volunteers, and 10% from people outside of Mozilla. What does that mean? It means that when we're designing stuff, we're able to get feedback from a really broad audience who have a whole bunch of different other perspectives. And I'm sure you guys have experienced that in working with community and writing code. It can be a little bit chaotic that way, but we end up making better stuff because we have more people who are part of it, who are able to provide insight. And when we synthesize that and figure out what all of that information means, we can make better things, make better designs. In this case, we were able to learn about how different audiences approach this page and what that means for new contributors who want to be involved. And we learned things that we would have never known if we had just looked at employees. Now let's step even further. Like, where could this stuff expand into where we haven't really tapped into it too much yet? When we do user research now, we actually contact community members in the locales where we go. And we sort of talk to them about what their culture is like. And we're able to actually talk to people on a more personal level and learn more valuable things about how they use technology. If we look at involving community more in that, we're able to get even deeper and really understand what sort of role does technology play in people's lives. And why does that matter? Because it allows us to design better stuff for people. We get insights about how people use things that maybe other companies couldn't access. Even with all the money in the world, you still can't really get that personal connection that somebody who's inspired about Mozilla's mission could find when they go and talk to somebody else about it in their local community. That's kind of cool. That opens up access to information that we might not have been able to find out before and allows us to make things that serve needs that people have that maybe we didn't really know existed. Okay, so that's enough about the business side of things. Next is looking at social design. Sort of the structures that we use to communicate, or some assumptions about how we communicate, sort of implicit things, perhaps. The first one, this is actually other research by Douglas Atkin. It's looking at when someone joins a community. These are two questions that people ask when they join a community. Are they like me? Will they like me? So when you're looking, you sort of want to see what people are about. Does this kind of match my view of the world? Is this something where I feel like I don't have to self-edit as much? Is this a place where I belong? Will they like me if I step in the door? And the importance of being clear about that, of actually asking these questions, you sort of find out where some gaps are. We find out if we're not really allowing people to answer this question of, are they like me? We find out if we're not being clear about who we are, what we stand for. We find out if we're not helping people when they step in the door and making them feel comfortable and welcomed. These kinds of things are really basic assumptions. They're things that sort of go without saying. But when you say them, it has a big impact because it changes how you approach what you're doing. Taking a step and looking at motivation. This is from Jimmy Wales, Wikipedia. It's from an interview actually, and the moderator is talking about like why do people participate and invest like a whole bunch of time in writing for Wikipedia. He talks about how that's kind of the wrong question to ask. Like, no one really asks why does someone spend 80 hours a week playing World of Warcraft? Why does someone spend 80 hours a week learning how to play the piano? Why does someone spend 80 hours a week learning how to do woodworking? They do it because it's fun, because it matters to them. And in the case of open source and Mozilla, it makes a noticeable impact in the world. That's pretty powerful. So it's not really about skill set, time, whatever the heck we want to look at there. It's about what matters to people, where that motivation is, where they feel like it's fun and valuable and they can make an impact on the world. And so I did some research earlier in the year on motivation from several interviews and actually drawing in some academic research on there as well. There were 6 different areas that I saw. Intrinsic motivation, pretty self-explanatory. Extrinsic motivation, motivation around being involved with the community. Preemptive generosity, which is about making things available to people before they ask for them. Social value, that what you do actually creates value in the world. That Jimmy Wales quote that we just saw. Helpfulness, wanting simply to help other people have a better experience. And again, implicit things kind of goes without saying. But when you can make those explicit, you're able to design around them and give people a better experience. You're able to help people more easily move from the furthest edge to the deepest center, to move through that pathway of participation. So let's go into one of my favorites. Let's see what emerges. When you bring a bunch of people into a project, stuff comes up from all over the place. It matters that you have more than one voice, and more than one voice is valued. It's not just, this is our direction, this is where we're going, everyone needs to follow along with that, don't really care what you have to say. We have a culture that supports a lot of people providing input. That helps us make better stuff. That helps us support community. And when that stuff emerges, and we're able to connect those dots, we're able to make some pretty cool stuff. Something way cooler than some turtle on a screen. Like something like Firefox, something like Firefox OS. All the awesome stuff that we make as part of Mozilla. WebMaker. This kind of stuff doesn't really exist in a lot of other organizations or companies. It's one of the things that makes Mozilla unique. It's important that we're aware of that we name those things, that we own those things, that we act upon those things, make them more explicit, and build upon them. So that's closing the social design section. So we've looked at the philosophy, this idea of being more than just a consumer, this idea that you can be a creator and participate with other people. We've looked at the business side of it, sort of the different models that we use, that commitment curve, that maturity model, the impact of involving a lot of people in a project to be able to do things that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. And then the social design, some kind of implicit things about how we interact that really matter when you're clear about them because you didn't design better experiences based off that. And that's the exploration of how we build why we build. And before I end, I want to go back to something that I talked about in the beginning, because to me it's a good theme of answering this question. You have the opportunity to participate. You have the option to be more than a consumer. You can create something. And community building is about helping people along that path, making that pathway easier so that you can be a creator with other people all over the world, work on whatever kind of stuff is interesting to you, whatever matters. Thank you. And that's the last slide, but questions if you have them. I'm happy to go back or answer whatever's out there.
What did you find most interesting, or what did you learn from the most while on your internship?
What did I find most interesting and what did I learn the most? Yeah, that's a great question. So it's actually sort of a theme that I saw. It's kind of the theme that I tried to bring to this presentation, which was when people work together, when there's a big organization working on something, there's a lot of things that are sort of taken as assumptions, taken without necessarily needing to be explicit. It's sort of like, let me give a different analogy. It's kind of like documentation matters. Like you can't just throw out something on GitHub and have no documentation on that, because then people don't know how to be a part of that. So for me, it was learning that, like, wow, that documentation, that stuff about how to get involved, that stuff about making involvement really easy, like, there's ways to do that, and that, like, makes a huge difference. Cool.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, thank you.